In section 9.4, we're going to talk about really the last hypothesis test that we're going to need for exam number 3, which is the ANOVA test. So in 9.2, we looked at comparing two different means from two different populations. Specifically, we looked at those when we had independent samples. And in 9.3, we looked at the idea that we would test means from different samples, but they were dependent. Well, we're going to be zooming in on this 9.2 section, where we compared two means. If you look on the formula sheet, you can see that that would be down here in our bottom left box. Now, in this box, what we saw was that, again, I had two independent samples, and then I would use this t-test to try to go ahead and compare these two averages to figure out maybe if they were the same size or if one was maybe larger or smaller than the other. Well, the only difference when I navigate over here to section 9.4 is I'm going to be interested in comparing multiple averages and attempting to see if they're equal to each other or perhaps if one is maybe different than the others. So we're going to go ahead and try to think about how we could actually make such comparisons. Well, suppose we have the following motivating scenario. Suppose a company has 3 manufacturing plants, okay? Call it plant 1, plant 2, and plant 3. And the company officials wants to determine whether there's a difference in the average age of the workers at the 3 locations. Maybe they're concerned about something, like do they have people that are planning on retiring sooner than others, but they might want this information for some reason. And if we're trying to figure out if there's a difference in the average age of workers at the 3 locations, that might be difficult to do. I'd have to know all of my employees' ages and average all of those out. Well, let's suppose that the following data are just the ages of 5 randomly selected workers at the plant. So I can see that, generally speaking, these are pretty young individuals that are at this plant. Well, let's go ahead and see how in the world I might be able to test if there's a difference in the average age of workers. So in order to do this, I'll say in order to see if there is a difference in the average ages, we would actually need to run. So I could say here we would need to run multiple 2-sample t-tests. And remember that these 2-sample t-tests came from section 9.2. So I'll try to highlight why that's the case. Because again, if I want to see if all of these things are equal or if maybe one of them are different, I would need to go ahead and do something like this. Here would be like maybe my first test. My first test would maybe be trying to compare what's happening with plant number 1 versus with plant number 2. Right? Like, does plant number 1 and plant number 2 have the same average? I can compare kind of like average number 1 to average number 2. Well, if I found that it was pretty reasonable to stick with an assumption that they were equal, then I could move forward and say, well, what about another test? To find if all of them are equal, I might now want to check, is plant number 1 going to pretty much have the same average as plant number 3? I want to compare the first and the third. But actually here I'm not done. I would have to do another test. I would have to do a third test, which would test if plant number 2 and plant number 3 actually had the same average. And this is a lot of testing. Can you imagine how annoyed you would be if you actually had to answer this question? Conduct 3 separate hypothesis tests? That would be a nightmare. And so one of our goals here is to try to figure out how we might be able to reduce the amount of work that goes into this, but in addition to that, to reduce the amount of error that may possibly be formed in making these tests. So really quickly here, I'll just say that we should recall that if alpha is equal to, say, 5% for a particular test, then this means there is a 5% chance of making a type 1 error specifically on any one test. But if I start having to conduct multiple tests in order to answer this big question, I kind of run a 5% risk here on the first test, another 5% risk on the next, and another 5% risk on the next. And as long as any one of those has an error, then the entire result would be thrown off. So I can start to see that since we have to run a lot of tests, we could see that this chance of making a type 1 error on any one test might possibly be larger. So I'll state here that the chances of making at least one error in these three tests will therefore be much higher than 5%. So what I'm going to start to see here is that the chances of making this type 1 error is really going to continue to increase. It's going to grow. And imagine if instead of having 3 plants around the country, maybe I'm with like some really big company. Maybe they got like 3,000 plants around the country or around the world, right? And so I'm going to have to run what? Like I don't even know how many tests. Like, that's going to be a lot of tests because I'm going to have to compare plant 1 to all the other plants, and then plant 2 to all the remaining plants, and then plant 3 to all the remaining plants. It's going to be a crazy number of tests. And that might mean that the chance of making at least one mistake somewhere in that process is going to be astronomically large. So what we want is a method where we can conduct this analysis very specifically here in a single test so that we don't increase our chances of making a type 1 error somewhere. If we can just do the test one time and answer the whole question in one go, it's a lot better. So to complete this, we'll use what we call an F distribution together with a technique called an analysis of variance. And this is where it comes in the idea of our ANOVA test. It's our one-way analysis of variance, ANOVA, and it's a hypothesis testing technique that is used specifically to compare the means of 3 or more populations, much like what we can see when we go to the formula sheet. Again, in 9.2, we were looking at 2 averages, and in 9.4, we're looking at comparing any number of averages, typically above 2. Now, in the next video, we'll take a look at how this ANOVA test actually works and take a look at kind of an overview of our test before getting into some examples.